"She can't bear pups, Marcus," my father spat, pushing me forward, my pale skin burning with humiliation. "Take her." Oak Haven Township smelled perpetually of rot and old snow, a perfect reflection of my own decaying future. At 23, I, Corinne Ashworth, was a burden, a walking shame, wolfless, barren, defective goods in the eyes of my alpha father. My only refuge was the intricate worlds I spun inside my head, stories where kindness mattered and rescue was real. I clung to them, desperate for anything that wasn't this reality. The air froze the day Marcus arrived. The ruthless tax collector strode into the village square, demanding impossible tribute for the formidable King Thane. My father, fearing the loss of his favored younger daughter, Chloe, saw an opportunity. He saw my uselessness. "She can't bear pups, Marcus," my father spat, pushing me forward, my pale skin burning with humiliation. "Take her, a slave to the crown. Her intellectual talents might fetch a higher price than grain, and we save Chloe." That night, I was bound and transported toward the chilling grandeur of Valen Ridge Citadel. The fortress loomed against the jagged mountains, a symbol of the tyranny I was now property of. I didn't know what fate awaited me, only that I was meant for the king. Yet, when I was dragged through the massive iron gates and down into the damp, shadowed depths, I wasn't presented to King Thane. Instead, the guards shoved me into a lightless chamber. Before a low, menacing growl, they left me there, terrified, faced with the horrific hidden guest, a creature cloaked in the shadows of the nocturnal shroud, a twisting knot of thick black fur and skeletal features. Compliance or death? I opened my mouth, swallowing my terror, and began to speak the first story I could conjure. My talent, my only weapon, had to buy me one more sunrise. The air in the chamber was thick with the scent of damp stone and something muskier, something wild and animalistic. After the initial surge of terror that had driven the first frantic words from my mouth, a strange silence settled. I had told him a convoluted tale of a cartographer lost in a frozen land, surviving purely on the memory of summer blooms. It was weak, fueled by panic, but when I finally paused, gasping for breath, the low, menacing growl didn't turn into a final swipe. Instead, a deep, resonating voice, scratchy as old leather and surprisingly articulate, echoed from the depths of the nocturnal shroud. "The cartographer was a fool," the creature stated, his voice devoid of inflection. "Why rely on illusion when survival demands fire and steel? Your narrative lacks practical application." My fear sharpened into defiance. Practical application. I was fighting for my life with fairy tales. "Practical application is relative," I countered, my voice shaking only slightly. "Survival sometimes demands hope, or the strength to remember what you are fighting for. Fire and steel save the body. Memory saves the soul." A moment of agonizing silence passed. I could feel the weight of his presence, the sheer size of the beast hidden beneath the cloak of shadow and thick black fur. "A bold claim, slave," he rumbled. "Tell me another story tomorrow, one with more fire, and perhaps a riddle." That was the pattern set. My life became a tether stretching between 2 points, the terrifying dark of night and the uncertain gray of dawn. Each sunset brought the inevitable. The requirement to weave intricate narratives and devise challenging riddles recorded meticulously in what would become my lifeline, the Journal of Narratives. He was a demanding audience. He didn't want simple romance or easy morality tales. Elias, though I didn't know his name then, only referring to him in my mind as the Beast, craved complexity. He enjoyed paradoxes, political maneuvering in fictional kingdoms, and philosophical debates disguised as dialogue between mythical characters. Why did the tyrant fail? He asked me one night after I finished a saga about a desert king who hoarded water. Because he feared loss more than he valued life, I responded instantly. "No," the Beast corrected, his voice a low vibration in the small space. "He failed because he misunderstood power. Power is not ownership. It is influence. You can own the water, but you cannot own the people's thirst for justice. The king in your tale was intellectually lazy." I was stunned. Intellectual laziness. This creature, this terrifying shadowed entity that should have torn me apart on the first night, was critiquing my fictional character's political strategy. Weeks bled into months in 1878. The damp, lightless chamber gradually transformed. It started with a single candle, then a writing slope, and ink, the tools necessary for me to prepare the daily installment of my survival. Soon, heavy furs appeared on the floor, replacing the cold stone. A tray of surprisingly high-quality food was left just outside the chamber door each evening. I realized he wasn't just tolerating me, he was investing in me. He was creating a sanctuary for my mind, even if my body was still a captive. He had given me space to write. He had given me the only thing I had ever truly possessed, my own intellectual freedom. I began to use my own life in Oak Haven Township as fodder, disguising the bitterness and shame I felt in intricate narratives about women trapped by societal expectations. One evening, I told him the story of the BARREN weaver. She was useless to her village, you see, I explained, holding the journal tightly. A waste of space, incapable of perpetuating the lineage. They valued her solely for her ability to bear life, her complex tapestries, her sharp wit, all discarded because she couldn't perform the essential function. I waited for the usual growl of disapproval, perhaps a remark on the harsh necessity of succession, but the beast remained silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I had ever heard it, almost wounded. "Did she survive?" he asked. "She fled," I whispered, "into a wilderness where the only currency was intellect, not blood." "Good," he muttered. "The world's arbitrary definitions of worth are a sickness. If she can think, she has value. All other measures are for fools." That was the moment I realized he truly saw me. Not Corinne Ashworth, the defective, wolfless daughter of an ambitious alpha. Not the barren slave bartered away for grain. He saw the weaver of stories, the woman whose mind was constantly churning, challenging and analyzing. He was the first person in my 23 years who valued me based purely on my internal landscape. My intense gray eyes, perpetually pale skin, small stature. None of it mattered to the thick black fur and skeletal features of the nocturnal shroud. Our intimacy developed in the exchange of ideas, the rigorous, exhausting battle of wits each night. I found myself looking forward to his challenges, even the frightening ones. He was a ruthless mind, but he was fair. He demanded excellence, and in doing so, he allowed me to flourish. I wrote faster, better, with more purpose than I ever had hiding under the floorboards in Oak Haven. I was falling in love with a creature I had never seen, one cloaked in eternal shadow, whose only light was the keen intelligence behind his amber eyes, eyes that only glowed dimly in the gloom. One cold night, 6 months into my confinement, after I had delivered a lengthy treatise on the failure of centralized governance, a thinly veiled commentary on King Thane's reign, he shifted on his stone bench, the fur rustling ominously. "Corinne," he used my name, which always felt heavy and significant on his tongue. "The political theories are compelling. They require application." I waited, my heart pounding. Was this the test? The final compliance? "I know what they said about you in Oak Haven," he continued, his voice low. I read Marcus's notes. "Barren, useless for breeding. My need is not for an heir, Corinne. My need is for a partner who can dissect the world with the same precision you dissect fictional kingdoms." He moved forward, and for the first time, I didn't recoil. He remained shrouded, but I could feel the heat radiating off his massive body. "Marry me," he proposed. The simplicity of the command stunned me into silence. Marriage? To the creature beneath the nocturnal shroud. A slave marrying a monster. "You know I cannot bear children," I finally managed. "The old shame trying to rear its head. That is precisely why I ask," he countered, his voice steady. "A political queen must bear heirs." "My queen, my companion, must bear strength, and you, Corinne, are strong. You look at me and you do not see the horror, you see the argument. I have never found that in the sunlit world." My vision blurred. This was it, the rescue I had always fantasized about in my childhood stories. Only it wasn't a knight on a white charger. It was a monster offering me unconditional acceptance of the very flaw that had defined my life. I loved him. I loved the ruthless, appreciative soul trapped inside the shroud. "Yes," I whispered, tears starting to trace paths down my pale cheeks. "Yes, I will marry you." He made a low sound, something between a deep sigh and a contented rumble. He didn't touch me. Physicality was not their bond. Intellect was. "We must wait for the spring thaw," he said. "The paperwork must be secured discreetly. My household believes you are merely a scribe, locked away for treasonous writings. We will maintain that facade until the ceremony." The weight of the journal felt lighter that night. I was a future queen, a queen defined by her mind, not her womb. 3 days later, the tragedy struck. It was a clear, cold afternoon, Nearing the end of winter, I was organizing my papers, having been permitted a brief hour of guarded exercise in the narrow corridor adjacent to the hidden chamber, a privilege he had slowly extended. Suddenly, a massive, distant crash shook the very foundations of Vallenridge Citadel. It sounded like an outer wall collapsing, followed by the shrieking sound of metal scraping stone. Guards began shouting, their voices laced with panic. The beast was always most vulnerable near dawn and dusk, when the curse transitioned. The sudden, violent shift in the Citadel's environment must have somehow disrupted the magic. I was shoved back into the chamber as the guards retreated to address the emergency. "Stay back, Corinne," the beast commanded, his voice raw with pain, louder than usual. I watched, horrified, as the edges of the nocturnal shroud seemed to thin, pulling away like smoke struggling against wind. The heavy black fur began to recede from the massive limbs. The air crackled with desperate, dying magic. I saw the change. It was instantaneous and brutal. Where the creature had stood, now knelt a man impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, collapsing under the lingering strain. His dark bronze hair was matted with sweat, and his skin was shockingly white. He turned his head slightly, and his intimidating amber eyes, the eyes I knew so well from the dim glow, were clear, human, and filled with utter terror and shame. Elias Kincaid, King Thane, the formidable, tyrannical ruler of Ethelgard, the man who owned the entire citadel, the man I had been bartered to as a slave. I stared at the king, the truth slamming into me like the shockwave that had started this chaos. I hadn't just fallen in love with a hidden monster. I had fallen in love with the ultimate source of my suffering, the prideful king who kept his deepest vulnerability locked away in the shadows. He was 36, the feared ruler. Now exposed, he scrambled backward, clutching his chest, breathing raggedly. "Get out!" he roared, the voice suddenly carrying the clear, authoritative timbre of royalty, not the raspy growl of the beast. "Did you see? How much did you see?" I took a step toward him. "Elias, it doesn't matter." "It matters!" he thundered, struggling to stand. The change was still precarious. He was sweating profusely, the cursed energy fighting against the human form. "You cannot stay. I gave you my word as the beast. I cannot fulfill it as the king." "But I accept you," I insisted, stepping closer, reaching out. "The soul I loved is right here. The intellect, the appreciation, it belongs to King Thane too." He recoiled as if struck, his amber eyes narrowing with the chilling ruthlessness I had only heard about, never witnessed firsthand. The pride, thick and suffocating, eclipsed the vulnerability. "Your acceptance is worthless now," he spat, the words sharp and cold. "Before you loved a creature defined by secrecy and pity. Now you know the truth. You love the king who is cursed, a king who is flawed. Your choice is compromised. You cannot look upon this weakness and truly choose it. You cannot." His fear was greater than my love. His shame was greater than the sanctuary he had built for me. The powerful, arrogant Elias Kincaid could never allow someone who knew his deep, shameful secret to stand beside him. The beast valued honesty. The king valued control. He struck a nearby gong used for emergencies. Guards rushed down the corridor, their faces grim. "Corinne Ashworth is a security risk," King Elias Kincaid commanded, his voice iron. "Escort her out of Vallenridge Citadel immediately. She is to be provided passage back to Oakhaven Township, and inform that her debt to the crown is considered paid in full. If she ever attempts to return, she will be executed for espionage." My heart didn't just break, it shattered into shards of granite. He was banishing me, not because I failed him, but because he failed himself. He believed his worth was tied to his public perfection, and my knowledge of his curse made me a threat to that facade. "Elias, please," I pleaded, grasping the front of his tunic, pulling him toward me. "I don't care about the crown. I only care about you." He gripped my wrists, his strength formidable, and pushed me away. "Go, Corinne, live your life," he said, turning his back on me. The darkness was already beginning to gather again as the sun dipped toward the horizon, and the curse was reasserting its dominance. He didn't want me to witness the transformation back into the nocturnal shroud. "I cannot risk your pity tainting my judgment." I was dragged out of Vallenridge Citadel, the fortress, which had become my sanctuary, my school, and the site of my greatest love, now spit me out like something toxic. I clutched the journal of narratives to my chest, its pages full of stories written for a monster who was Tragically, just a king too proud to be loved in his entirety. The journey back to Oakhaven was a blur of cold and emptiness. My father was furious that I hadn't brought back wealth, only a meager travel stipend and a release from my slave status. He demanded to know what happened. I told him nothing, locking myself away. I spent the next year in Oakhaven, the harsh reality of the village a crushing weight compared to the intellectual grandeur of the Citadel chambers. But I was changed. I was no longer the shame-filled girl. I was the woman who had loved a monster. I wrote constantly, filling new pages in the journal, trying to reconcile the king and the beast, the pride and the passion. News traveled slowly, but inevitably. In the late summer of 1879, a messenger passed through Oakhaven carrying official royal decrees. King Elias Kincaid was set to marry Princess Leanna of the Western Isles, a purely political alliance designed to secure crucial trade routes and military support. The ceremony was scheduled for the autumn equinox at Vallen Ridge Citadel. When I heard the news, a cold resolve settled in my bones. Elias was choosing political expediency over love, hiding his secret behind a convenient marriage, burying the truth of the beast entirely. I wasn't going to let him do it. I needed to return, not as a former slave, and certainly not as a grieving lover. I needed to return as the truth, the living embodiment of the unconditional love he had rejected. Using the small sum I had saved from selling my intellectual writings anonymously in neighboring towns, I booked passage back toward the Citadel, arriving 2 days before the ceremony. I managed to secure a spot in the back row of the massive formal reception hall, a location reserved for minor nobles from peripheral regions, thanks to a small bribe and a forged letter of invitation. The great hall of Vallen Ridge Citadel was opulent, smelling of expensive lilies and polished mahogany. King Elias Kincaid stood at the altar, looking every inch the formidable, ruthless king. Tall, powerful, his bronze hair shining beneath the cathedral light, his amber eyes fixed and serious. He wore the crown, a heavy weight of gold and jewels, but to me, he looked hollow. He was marrying a beautiful foreign woman for practical application, just as he had initially judged my cartographer's tale. Princess Leanna, draped in ivory lace, approached him with reserved elegance. The ceremony began, solemn and grand. I stood far back, clutching a worn leather satchel. The journal of narratives was inside. I had rehearsed what I would say, how I would confront him, but I knew it had to be a moment of pure, unadulterated necessity. The priest reached the moment of the vows. Do you, Elias Kincaid, take Leanna to be your lawfully wedded wife? That's when chaos erupted. It started subtly, a faint metallic scent overriding the perfume of the lilies. Then, a sharp thwack as an arrow embedded itself inches from the king's head, striking the ornate gold altar. Assassins. They were everywhere, emerging from concealed doors in the walls, masked and clad in black leather. They were targeting the king. Instinct, sharpened by a year of fear and then love, took over. I didn't think about the risk, the banishment, or the death sentence hanging over my head. I thought only of the vulnerable, prideful man who was about to be destroyed. I moved before anyone else did. While the guards scrambled to form a defensive line, I sprinted down the central aisle. The king, reacting swiftly, had already drawn the sword hidden beneath his cloak and was engaging the first two attackers. A third assassin, flanking from the left, lunged, aiming a dagger directly at Elias's exposed flank. I threw myself forward, not with a weapon, but with my body. I tackled the king, knocking him and myself violently to the marble floor, forcing the dagger to scrape harmlessly against the stone where his side had been. We landed hard. My head cracked against the marble, stars bursting behind my eyes. "Corinne!" I heard him shout, a sound of pure shock and fury. He was instantly back on his feet, engaging 2 more men. I scrambled backward, dizzy, realizing I was directly in the line of fire, but my action had bought him a critical second. It was more than enough. The physical shock of the blow, combined with the extreme adrenaline of combat, and the immediate raw recognition of my presence, overwhelmed the residual magic holding the curse at bay. The sun had just set outside the high windows, and the transition was due. A horrifying sound, not quite a roar, but a tearing, ripping sound, filled the hall. The air grew thick and heavy, and the lights dimmed instantaneously. The transformation was agonizing to watch. King Elias Kincaid collapsed, seizing, his skin stretching, tearing, black fur erupting across his body, his bones lengthening and distorting. The elegant wedding robes shredded around him, replaced by the monstrous shadow and skeletal features of the nocturnal shroud. The entire hall fell silent. The assassins froze. The priest shrieked. Princess Lyanna fainted. There, where the king had stood, was the beast. Massive, terrifying, cloaked in the horror I knew so intimately. He stood revealed, his thick black fur matted with the blood of the assassins he had already struck down. The beast, standing exposed in the middle of the grand wedding hall of Valenridge Citadel, was the symbol of King Thane's greatest secret. He turned his monstrous head toward me, his amber eyes glowing with a terrifying mix of agony and rage. The sheer terror in the room was palpable, but I stood my ground, ignoring the throbbing pain in my head. This was my stage. This was the moment I had bought. "Elias," I said, my voice cutting through the ringing silence, steady and clear despite my fear. "Look at me." He hesitated, the enormous bulk of him shifting. "I was banished because you feared my pity," I continued, ignoring the gasps and whispers surrounding us. "You thought my choice was compromised because I knew you were king. You believed true love meant loving the beast more than the king." I took a deliberate step toward the monster, ignoring the horrified face of my supposed rival, Princess Lyanna, lying unconscious on the floor. "But the truth is, I don't love the beast or the king. I love Elias Kincaid, the man who values my intellect, the soul beneath the shame, the one who saw the worth in the barren weaver." My voice cracked slightly, heavy with a year of repressed sorrow. "I loved you when I thought you were just a hidden horror, and I love you now that I know you are a flawed king. Your defect, your curse, it changes nothing about you. I choose you, unconditionally, even knowing your secret and your pride. I choose the whole of you." I reached out and placed my hand firmly against the coarse, matted fur covering his skeletal cheek. It felt strangely familiar, exactly as I had imagined. "You didn't need someone to love the beast more than the king, Elias. You needed to learn to love me more than your own secret and your own tyrannical pride. And I pray, after what you just saw me risk, that you finally understand that true worth is measured not by the life one bears, but by the love one gives." As the last word left my lips, the massive body of the beast began to shudder violently. The nocturnal shroud didn't just recede this time, it dissolved, evaporating like mist under a sudden sun. A golden light, blinding and pure, enveloped him. The change was quick, gentle, and utterly miraculous. When the light faded, King Elias Kincaid stood naked on the marble floor, returned fully to his human form. His bronze hair was slightly disheveled, his eyes clear and wide with realization, no longer filled with shame. The curse was gone. He looked at me, not with the terrifying ruthlessness of a king, but with the unguarded vulnerability of the man I had loved in the shadows. He didn't look at the crowd, the stunned guards, or the unconscious princess. He looked only at Corin Ashworth, the intellectual, the resilient idealist, the one who had survived by story, and who had conquered the curse with truth. He took a hesitant step toward me, his hand reaching out, mirroring my earlier gesture. "Corinne," he whispered, the name a profound recognition. "You saved me. Not from the assassins, but from myself." The crown lay forgotten on the ground. He picked up my hand, bringing it to his lips, his gaze locked with mine. The hall was still paralyzed, waiting for the king's command. Elias straightened, drawing a deep, steady breath. He turned to the stunned assembly, the light of true power radiating from him, a power tempered by love, not pride. "The curse is broken," King Elias Kincaid declared, his voice ringing through the hall. "My political alliance is dissolved. Princess Lyanna will be returned to her family with honors and generous compensation." He turned back to me, taking my hand and pulling me forward until I stood beside him, claiming my destiny. "There will be no wedding today," he announced to his court and the surviving guests, "but there will be a queen. Corinne Ashworth, you taught me that intellectual sanctuary is true power, and that love accepts the whole truth, regardless of the facade. I ask you now, before these witnesses, will you rule with me? Will you be my queen?" I looked at his face, clear and bright, free of the shadow that had tormented him for years. I saw the king, yes, but I saw the beast's appreciation shining through those amber eyes. "Yes, Elias," I said finally, completely free. "I will be your queen." I was no longer the barren, useless burden of Oakhaven. I was the queen of Ethelgard, proving that the only true defect is the inability to see value where society refuses to look. My true worth was not in the life I could bear, but in the love I gave, and the story I lived. If you enjoyed this exploration of King Elias and Corinne's journey, please like this story and consider subscribing for more tales of intellectual romance and redemption. The air outside Vallenridge Citadel in late winter was sharper, colder than the controlled atmosphere of the stone chambers. I was thrown onto a small, covered carriage, given just enough coin for the journey back, and told, in no uncertain terms, that I was paying for my life with permanent exile. Her debt to the crown is considered paid in full, as if 6 months of genuine intellectual companionship, vulnerability, and a proposal of marriage could be erased by a ledger entry. The guard's cruelty was mundane compared to the king's. King Elias Kincaid, the man I had fallen in love with, had traded my mind for his pride. He was more terrified of the world knowing his secret than he was devoted to the woman who had already accepted it. Oakhaven Township, when I returned, was a muddy, gray prison. My father, the alpha whose greatest desire was a respectable lineage, saw my return as confirmation of my utter worthlessness. I was not even fit to be a slave. He hadn't gained the wealth he hoped for. Only a barren daughter returned. He screamed at me, the shame radiating off him like a physical heat, demanding details of the treasonous writings that led to my sudden release. I gave him only silence, my pale skin feeling tighter, thinner than ever. I locked myself in the miserable, drafty room that had once been my sanctuary of hidden books, but now felt too small, too close. I needed the intellectual expanse Elias had offered me, even if it came wrapped in the nocturnal shroud. The journal of narratives became my confessional, my battlefield. I wrote relentlessly, filling page after page, dissecting the tragedy. I argued with Elias on paper. I justified the beast's actions, then condemned the king's arrogance. The king fears vulnerability, I scrawled one night in a shaky hand. He believes power is defined by the absence of need. The beast knew better. The beast needed me. I couldn't stay dependent on my father. I used the skills Elias had unintentionally sharpened. I began writing philosophical essays and challenging political satires under a pseudonym, selling them discreetly through contacts in neighboring, less superstitious towns. The money was meager, but it was mine. It was currency earned purely through intellect, precisely as the beast had once said was the only true measure of worth. A year passed, marked by the brutal cycle of the seasons in Oakhaven. The deep gray of my eyes held a new intensity, forged in the crucible of loss and self-reliance. I turned 24 in solitude, surrounded by the ghosts of stories written for a captive audience of one. Then, in the late summer of 1879, the royal decree arrived, posted crudely on the Oakhaven notice board. King Elias Kincaid, to marry Princess Liana of the Western Isles, cementing an alliance necessary for Ethelgard's stability. The ceremony was scheduled for the autumn equinox at Vallenridge Citadel. I read the name Liana and felt a profound, cold certainty settle in my chest, replacing the year-long ache of heartbreak. Elias was choosing control. He was sealing his secret away forever, sacrificing his chance at genuine connection for political application. The very practical advice he had once praised the beast for possessing. He was letting the fear of the beast destroy the king. This was not jealousy. This was duty. I had been offered a sanctuary, an acceptance that transcended physical form, and I owed that soul the truth, even if the king was too proud to accept it. I meticulously planned my return. Using my saved earnings, I bought new, respectable though plain clothing, and arranged passage toward the citadel, telling my father I was seeking employment in the capital. He barely looked up from his ledgers. To him, I was still the burden leaving. Vallenridge Citadel, massive and foreboding, loomed over the city. I used every scrap of information I had learned during my confinement. The minor court gossip overheard through the thick walls, the hierarchy of guards, the weaknesses in protocol, a sizable bribe and a skillfully forged letter of invitation, claiming to represent a minor forgotten noble house from the southern territories, got me past the initial checkpoints. I secured a spot in the absolute back row of the grand reception hall, the location usually reserved for those deemed insignificant. I blended into the periphery, a small stature in a sea of silks and velvets, clutching the worn leather satchel containing my life's work, the Journal of Narratives. The hall was overwhelming. It smelled of power, wealth, and lilies, a scent of sterile opulence that choked the air. The king stood at the altar. Elias, 36, radiating a chilling competence. He was magnificent, tall, and powerful in his state robes, the heavy gold crown catching the cathedral light. But his amber eyes, usually so sharp and alive with intellectual fire, looked strangely muted. He was playing a part, the flawless king. Princess Liana, lovely and composed, drifted toward him in a cascade of ivory lace. She was everything I was not: politically advantageous, presumably fertile, publicly desirable. She was the acceptable choice. The ceremony began. The words were ancient, weighty, binding. I gripped the journal tightly, my knuckles white. "Don't do this, Elias," I thought. The plea silent, desperate. "Don't choose the lie." The priest reached the moment that seals the pact. "Do you, Elias Kincaid, take Liana to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The metallic tang of iron, sharp and sudden, cut through the sweetness of the lilies. The whack, an arrow, tipped in black, slammed into the ornate wood of the altar, narrowly missing the king's head. Chaos exploded. It was swift and terrifying. Black-clad figures, masked and armed, erupted from hidden panels in the walls. Assassins, targeting the king during his most vulnerable moment of political display. Guards shouted, but they were scrambling, trying to assess the threat vectors. Elias was already moving, demonstrating the brutal, swift efficiency I had often imagined the beast possessing. He tore the sword from beneath his ceremonial cloak, the polished steel glinting, and engaged 2 men instantly. But a third assassin, sleek and fast, had maneuvered around the far pillar. He lunged, a short dagger aimed at the small gap in the king's armor, directly into his side. My mind didn't register risk, exile, or death. It registered only the flaw in his defense. The man who had given me intellectual sanctuary was exposed. I didn't reach for a weapon. I threw myself forward, abandoning the sanctuary of the back row. I sprinted down the aisle of polished marble, a small, pale missile of necessity. "Elias!" I screamed, a raw sound ripped from my throat. I hit him with all my slight weight, tackling him hard, driving both of us off our feet and crashing to the cold marble. The dagger scraped harmlessly against the stone floor where his flesh should have been. My head struck the floor violently. Pain, sharp and blinding, washed over me, replacing the fear. I lay momentarily stunned, stars swirling behind my gray eyes. "Corinne, what in the name of the gods?" Elias roared, already rolling and striking a fourth attacker. I crawled backward, dizzy, watching the flurry of lethal movement, but my action had served its purpose. It was not just the physical impact of the fall, it was the raw recognition, the shock of seeing the woman he had banished, combined with the extreme adrenaline of life-or-death combat that overwhelmed the fragile internal magic that held the curse dormant during the day. The transition was overdue. The sun had fully set moments before. The fight stopped abruptly. Not because of the guards, but because of the sound. It was a guttural tearing noise, like fabric ripping across stone, followed by a sudden intense drop in temperature. King Elias Kincaid, caught mid-strike, collapsed. The golden light that accompanied the transformation was painful to look at, but this time it was chaotic, laced with violent energy. He seized on the marble, his massive frame distorting, bones cracking and shifting. The royal robes shredded, utterly useless against the erupting force of the nocturnal shroud. Thick, coarse black fur surged outward, covering the king, consuming him. The grand reception hall of Valenridge Citadel, the symbol of absolute royal power, was plunged into a chilling, stunned silence. The beast stood where the king had been. He was taller, wider, impossibly terrifying, his skeletal features defined by the deep shadow of the shroud. He was covered in the fresh blood of the men he had already dispatched, standing monstrous and revealed beneath the opulent chandeliers. The assassins stared, momentarily paralyzed by a horror more potent than the king's blade. The priest made a whimpering noise. Princess Liana lay senseless in her ivory gown. The beast slowly turned his enormous head, his amber eyes, glowing fiercely in the gloom, locked onto me, Corinne, small, pale, bruised, but standing firm in the middle of the carnage. His gaze was a terrifying mix of animalistic rage and the profound, raw agony of exposure. This was it, The moment I had traveled a year and risked my life for. I ignored the throbbing in my skull and the paralyzing terror in the hall. "Elias," I said again, my voice ringing out, steady and impossibly clear. "Look at me. Look at what you are willing to risk to hide." He didn't move, his body tensed, ready to fight, flee, or kill. "I was banished because you feared my pity," I continued, taking a step toward the monster, ignoring the desperate pleas of a nearby guard to stay back. "You believed my choice was compromised because I knew you were king. You told yourself that true love meant someone loving the beast more than the king." I stopped just shy of the beast's massive form, forcing myself to look up at the hideous shadowed face. "But you were wrong, Elias. I don't love the beast or the king. I love Elias Kincaid. I love the ruthless, appreciative soul beneath the shame, the one who saw the worth in the barren weaver." My voice deepened, infused with the sorrow of the past year and the fierce resilience that had brought me back. "I loved you when I thought you were just a hidden horror, and I love you now that I know you are a flawed king. Your defect, your curse, it changes nothing about you. I choose you unconditionally, even knowing your secret and your tyrannical pride. I choose the whole of you, Elias." I lifted my hand, trembling slightly, and placed it firmly against the coarse, blood-matted fur of his cheek. It was exactly the texture I had imagined that night, 6 months ago, when he asked me to marry him. "You didn't need someone to love the beast more than the king, Elias," I finished, my voice thick with emotion, but absolutely resolute. "You needed to learn to love me more than your own secret and your own crushing pride. And I pray, after what you just saw me risk to protect you, that you finally understand that true worth is measured not by the life one bears, but by the love one gives." The instant the final word settled in the air, a profound energy shift occurred. The beast's body shuddered, not with pain, but with release. The air pressure dropped violently, and a golden light, not chaotic like the transformation, but pure, overwhelming, and warm, erupted from the center of the nocturnal shroud. The fur and shadow didn't tear away. They dissolved, evaporating instantly, leaving behind nothing but heat and steam. The transformation back to Elias Kincaid was gentle, miraculous. He stood naked, tall, and whole, the golden light fading, leaving him utterly human. His bronze hair was mussed, his breathing shallow, but his amber eyes were clear, unburdened by shame, filled instead with devastating realization. The curse was broken. He ignored the gasps of the court, the stunned silence of the assassins who were quickly being subdued by the no-recovering guards. He ignored the crown lying forgotten at his feet. He looked only at me. "Corinne," he whispered, the name a complete acceptance, a profound acknowledgement of everything we had been through. "You saved me. You saved me from the prison of my own arrogance." He took a tentative step toward me, his hand reaching out, meeting mine. He brought my hand to his lips, his gaze never leaving my face, searching my gray eyes for any flicker of regret. He found none. The king, stripped bare of both robe and secret, straightened. The entire court, from the terrified nobles to the victorious guards, waited, paralyzed, for their ruler's command. Elias took a deep, steady breath, the very picture of power, but now tempered by the humility of love. "The curse is broken," King Elias Kincaid declared, his voice ringing through the vast hall, echoing the truth that had just transpired. "My political alliance is dissolved. Princess Liana will be returned to her family with honors and generous compensation. She is owed a better fate than marriage to a king who still struggled with himself." He turned, pulling me forward until I stood firmly beside him, his hand gripping mine, not in command, but in partnership. He was claiming me publicly, definitively. "There will be no wedding today," he announced to his court, "but there will be a queen. Corinne Ashworth, you taught me that intellectual sanctuary is true power, and that love accepts the whole truth, regardless of the facade or the risk. I ask you now, before these witnesses, will you rule with me? Will you be my queen?" I looked at the king, the formidable man whose heart I had known in the darkest shadows, whose intellect had matched mine, and whose pride had nearly destroyed him. He was asking for a partnership defined by honesty, not necessity. "Yes, Elias," I said, the word a liberation. "I will be your queen." The cheers were hesitant at first, then swelled into a triumphant roar, as the court realized the miracle they had just witnessed. I, Corinne Ashworth, the barren, wolfless daughter of Oakhaven, the bartered slave, now stood on the altar of Valenridge Citadel. My worth was measured not by the life I could bear, but by the love I gave and the uncompromising truth I insisted upon. I had not been rescued. I had claimed my destiny. I was home. If you found worth in Corinne's story and her fight for truth, please like this narrative and consider subscribing for more tales of intellectual romance and redemption. The cheers that finally erupted were not those of relief, nor even strictly of joy, but of sheer, staggering awe, laced with political terror. They were the sound of an entire court realizing that the immutable structure of their world had just been irrevocably torn open and Rasoon on the spot. Elias the king stood naked on the cold marble, exposed and magnificent, radiating a power that had nothing to do with the heavy gold crown, now lying discarded by the altar step. He still held my hand, grounding himself to the reality I had created for him. I felt the pulse of his life force, steady and strong, beneath the calluses of his palm. "Guards," Elias commanded, his voice deep, vibrating with a new, terrifying clarity. "Secure the remaining assassins. We will ascertain their loyalties and affiliations immediately. The body count is irrelevant. Bring me the architect of this attempt." The guards, shaken out of their paralysis, moved with brutal efficiency. The clang of swords and the dull thud of bodies being dragged across the floor punctuated the sudden, oppressive silence of the noble crowd. Princess Liana, pale and trembling, was being gently lifted by her retainers. Her eyes, wide and bewildered, drifted from the naked king to the bloodstains on her pristine ivory gown, and finally to me. There was no hatred in her gaze, only the confusion of a woman who had planned a diplomatic life and instead witnessed a theological miracle. Elias addressed her directly, releasing my hand only long enough to scoop up a heavy velvet mantle, thrown to him by a quick-thinking guard captain, wrapping it around his waist with casual disregard for decorum. "Princess Liana," he said, his tone measured, respectful, yet entirely final. "I offer you my deepest apologies for this barbaric display. The pact is nullified. Your honor is intact. You will receive an immediate full settlement that will ensure the prosperity of the Western Isles for the next 3 generations. You are free of this obligation." Liana could only nod, mute with shock. The weight of political advantage had evaporated, replaced by the crushing truth that she had nearly married a man who turned into a creature of shadow. The rest of the court remained frozen, their finely tailored silks barely concealing the violent spasms of fear running through them. Elias Kincaid had always been known for his control. This spectacle, the blood, the sudden transformation, the intimate declaration, shattered the illusion of absolute, cold sovereignty he had so carefully cultivated. "Hear me, all of you," Elias declared, pulling me back to his side, his hand settling firmly on my shoulder. "The secrecy is over. The nocturnal shroud is gone. For decades I lived under a curse born of arrogance and pride. Tonight I was saved, not by the strength of Ethelgard's legions, nor by political maneuvering, but by the intellectual bravery and unconditional love of Corin Ashworth. He looked down at me, and his fierce amber eyes softened briefly into something intensely personal. She saw the truth of me, king, beast, and man, and chose the man beneath the secret. The curse did not require someone to love the beast more than the king. It required the king to value vulnerability and genuine connection above the shield of his own power. Corinne taught me that. He paused, letting the weight of the confession settle on every powerful shoulder in the hall. "Corinne Ashworth, of Oakhaven Township, will be my queen. Any who challenge her position, her lineage, or her worth, challenge the very foundation upon which this kingdom will now be built. Let the consequences of that be understood." The silence held for another excruciating moment before the chancellor, a portly man whose face was still sheet-white with shock, finally gathered his wits. The crown, your majesty," he stammered, gesturing to the gold circle abandoned near the altar rail. Elias glanced at it, a flicker of dry amusement in his eyes. "Fetch it, Chancellor. It needs to be polished, and prepare the necessary writs. We require an immediate, if unconventional, private ceremony, followed by a public ratification within the week. I want the world to know what transpired here, and why." He gently took my elbow, guiding me away from the bloodshed and the scent of lilies. We walked past the rows of stunned, bowing nobles, whose respect was now tinged with genuine fear and reverence for the miracle. As we reached the massive arched doorway, I felt the dull throb in my head intensify. The physical reality of tackling a 36-year-old man in full adrenaline combat was finally catching up to me. "Corinne, are you injured?" Elias's voice was suddenly stripped of the king's authority, reverting to the deeply attentive, analytical tone of the beast in the hidden chamber. "Just a profound headache, Elias, and a few spectacular bruises, I imagine," I managed, leaning slightly against his side. The warmth radiating off his human body felt intensely alien, yet reassuringly real. He led me not back through the staterooms, but through the winding, forgotten corridors that led directly to the section of the citadel where he had kept his nightly sanctuary, the very rooms I had been banished from a year ago. The chambers were exactly as I remembered them, massive, quiet, draped in heavy, dark tapestries designed to conceal the beast's activities. But now, the space felt lighter, the shadows defeated by the golden light that must have permeated the walls during the curse breaking. Elias stopped in the center of the room. "We are home, Corinne." I swallowed, my eyes tearing up slightly from exhaustion and the overwhelming emotion. "It looks strangely empty without the nocturnal shroud looming over everything." He smiled, a rare, unburdened expression that utterly transformed his sharp, intimidating features. "It feels empty too. For the first time, I don't feel the weight of anticipation every sunset. You lifted a literal shroud from my soul." A moment later, a maid, already informed of the king's wishes, and probably terrified into extreme obedience, arrived with clean linen, a heavy robe for Elias, and a restorative herbal draught for me. While Elias dressed, regaining his formal dignity even in borrowed, simple garments, I walked toward the writing desk. There, tucked neatly beneath a bronze lamp, was the heavy leather satchel I had clutched throughout the journey. I opened it and pulled out the journal of narratives. It was stained and worn, filled with the cramped, frantic ink of a woman writing for her life and her love. "This is what brought me back," I said, placing the journal on the desk. "This is the only tribute I ever truly offered the crown." Elias came up behind me, resting his hands lightly on my shoulders, his chin brushing the top of my head. I was still so small against his frame, yet I felt utterly massive in my own authority. "I spent a year reading those pages, Corinne, the ones you left behind before I sent you away," he confessed, his voice rough with remembered regret. "I tried to rationalize my decision. I told myself that you were better off, that the secret would destroy you eventually. I justified my pride by labeling it protection." "And what did the king find in the writings of the Baron Weaver?" I asked softly, tracing the worn cover of the journal. "The king found the only person who had ever truly seen him. The beast knew that. The king was too foolish to accept it," Elias admitted. He turned me to face him, his eyes boring into mine. "When I saw you run down that aisle, not for glory, but to shield the man who had wronged you, I knew. I knew my entire structure of power, based on ruthlessness and isolation, was hollow. I was so afraid that if the world knew the beast existed, they would invalidate the king. But you forced the opposite truth. The king is only truly valid when he stops hiding the beast." I reached up, placing my hand over his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "It was never about saving the king from the beast, Elias. It was about saving Elias Kincaid from his own crippling shame. That shame was the true curse, and you were willing to die for that clarity," he murmured, his gaze intense. "I banished you for fear of pity, and you returned with unconditional sacrifice. The debt is truly paid, Corinne." The headache was receding, replaced by a quiet sense of fierce satisfaction. I had not merely survived, I had architected the resolution of a supernatural curse, using only my intellect and my truth. "Now, about the future," Elias said, his expression becoming sharp and focused again. "The king returning, but a better king. The court is in disarray. We must move swiftly to solidify your position, before political opportunists try to argue the legitimacy of a queen who arrived covered in blood and scandal." "Scandal defined my life in Oakhaven," I replied, a hint of steel in my voice. "I am accustomed to navigating the margins. What do you propose?" "Transparency, for one. And authority, immediately," he said, releasing me to pace the room. "I will issue a full decree tomorrow morning, detailing the curse and the terms of its dissolution. It will be recorded for history. And the wedding will take place tomorrow evening. Private, legally binding, witnessed by the Chancellor and the Chief Justice. We will then present the fait accompli to the world." I raised an eyebrow. Tomorrow evening? No time for a proper gown, I assume? Elias stopped, a hint of the playful appreciation I remembered from the beast flashing in his eyes. We can manage a gown. But frankly, Corinne, I think you have already proven that finery is entirely unnecessary to command attention. You are the only person in this citadel who has ever wrestled a monster to save a king. That is your gown. The next 24 hours were a blur of intense activity, unlike anything I had ever witnessed in the languid, superstitious life of Oakhaven. The citadel, usually a slow-moving monolith of tradition, became a crucible of royal fiat. Elias was decisive, utilizing the intense shock of the previous night to steamroll any potential opposition. The writs were prepared. The assassins, identified as agents of a rival kingdom, who had bet on the king's stability being compromised by his curse, were swiftly dealt with, making Elias look both miraculously powerful and ruthlessly efficient, a combination the people of Ethelgard appreciated. My father, the Alpha of Oakhaven, who had traded me away as worthless chattel, received a terse, heavily sealed royal notification informing him that his eldest barren daughter was now queen, and that he was henceforth prohibited from ever setting foot within 100 miles of the capital. The shame he felt would now be matched only by the crushing, humiliating irony of my triumph. As the sun began to set on the day following the broken curse, the second night of Elias's freedom, I stood before a looking-glass in the private suite. I was dressed in a simple gown of deep sapphire, chosen less for extravagance and more for its color, which matched the intensity of my gray eyes. I felt less like a bride, and more like a warrior preparing for a long campaign. My maid, a kind woman named Alina, who had been brought over from Princess Lyanna's retinue and now pledged absolute loyalty to the new regime, fussed over my hair. "You have brought such a light to the citadel, Your Majesty," Alina whispered, arranging a simple silver circlet upon my brow, a temporary crown until the proper coronation could be organized. We all felt the shadows lifting this morning. The shadows were not just the curse, Alina, I corrected, turning to look at her. They were the shame. We must teach the court that there is nothing to fear in the truth. A knock sounded, and Elias entered. He wore simple, functional royal attire, dark blue and bronze. He looked every bit the formidable king, but the rigid lines of his shoulders were relaxed, his gaze softer, fixed only on me. "Corinne," he said, the name still sounding like a revelation on his tongue. He dismissed the maid with a gesture. He walked toward me, stopping just short, a palpable space of shared history between us. "I know this is not the grand ceremony that was intended," he began. "No elaborate processions. No thousands of cheering subjects. I prefer it this way," I said, meeting his eyes. "The opulence of the ceremony yesterday was designed to hide a lie. This ceremony, however small, is built on truth. It is built on a truth that required you to risk everything," he corrected, taking my hands. "I owe you a lifetime, Corinne, not just for breaking the curse, but for showing me what genuine worth looks like. You, who were deemed worthless by your community for failing to produce life, are the one who gave me back mine." I gripped his hands fiercely. "My worth, Elias, was measured the moment you saw value in my mind, even when I was a slave presented to a monster. You created a sanctuary for my stories, and in return, I built you a bridge back to humanity." The private ceremony was brief, held in a small, consecrated chapel within the citadel, witnessed only by the required legal and religious authorities. The vows were simple, but weighted with meaning that transcended ancient traditions. We were binding not only two lives, but two political ideals, ruthless competence married to absolute intellectual honesty. When the Chief Justice pronounced us bound, Elias did not simply kiss me. He held me as if I were the anchor that prevented him from drifting back into the terrifying solitude of his secret. Later that night, we stood together on the highest battlement of Valenridge Citadel, looking out over the sleeping city. The air was cool, smelling of late summer rain. The stars were brilliant, unfiltered by the haze of the capital. I leaned into him, feeling the familiar sense of sanctuary I had first experienced in the darkest depths of the hidden chamber. Only now, there was no shadow, no terror, only the steady, comforting presence of the man I loved. "What will you write about now, my queen?" Elias asked, his voice low, intimate. I smiled, resting my head against his shoulder. "I will write about a new kind of kingdom, Elias, one where intellect is valued above bloodline, and resilience above inherited power. I will write the truth of Ethelgard's history, unburdened by the myths of the curse. I reached inside the folds of my dress, pulling out the small, familiar, leather-bound journal of narratives. It was the only item I had insisted on carrying with me, even to the altar. This journal was my weapon, my shield, and my refuge, I said, turning it over in my hands. I don't need it for survival anymore, but I need it to define my purpose. I am Corinne Ashworth, the storyteller who became queen. I will prove to every village in Ethelgard, and especially to places like Oakhaven, that worth is not measured by the life one bears, but by the love one gives, and the truth one insists upon. Elias took the journal from me, running his thumb over the worn leather. He didn't open it, he simply held it, an acknowledgement of the true power it represented. And I, King Elias Kincaid, will stand by the woman who saved me from myself, he promised. The beast is gone, but the humility remains. You are my true counsel, my equal, and my destiny. He looked down at me, the gray light of dawn beginning to streak the eastern horizon, illuminating the uncompromising love in his amber eyes. I had come to the citadel as bartered property in 1878, a source of shame. I stood here in 1879, claiming my crown, validated by the power of my own unwavering heart. The grand adventure of fiction I had always longed for had become my brutal, beautiful reality. I was home, finally, in the arms of the man who had loved my mind before he knew my name. If you found worth in Corinne's story and her journey from barren outcast to celebrated queen, please show your support by liking this narrative and subscribing for more tales of intellectual romance and hard-won redemption.